You're listening to Politics Unspun with me, Jack McCluskey.
And me, Charlie Carter.
We're two economists discussing the hottest political debates.
Like, do tax cuts really boost economic growth?
How high should the minimum wage be?
Is Scotland ready for independence?
Should post-work pints be free?
Yes. And because there's nothing we love more than the sound of our own voices, we're putting our future career prospects on the line to share our thoughts on each one of these deliciously controversial topics.
We hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to our third episode of Politics Unspun.
We made it.
And it's a historic
Third
episode.
and final. So listen up.
It's a historic episode because it's the first one that we're in person.
We are.
I know, and it's
so
quite nice.
Yeah, he lives other way across the country nowadays, so it's nice to see him every now and again. As long as our altercations don't turn physical, it's all good.
And today we're talking about non-dom, which has been fairly controversial. It's been in the media a lot, so it's become quite a political issue. But on Politics Unspun, we like to take
We
that
love
away.
political issues.
Yeah. Let's take it to its objective roots. So, Charlie, you kick off for me. What is non-dom?
So, obviously non-dom, as you've alluded to beautifully, Jack, is become a very big part of the political discourse recently, became a major part of the general election, and became quite personal with Rishi Sunak's wife at one point. But essentially a non-dom stands for non-domicile, and is anyone who is living in the UK but claims to have their permanent residence abroad. And this is essentially to lower tax for people who are coming here on a temporary basis, so they don't have to pay tax twice. And it's also being used by more free market politicians to try and encourage high net worth individuals to come to the UK and add to the economy. That's what they at least think. Is that broadly correct, Jack, do you think?
Yeah, no, it is. So, it's primary residence for tax purposes is outside the UK. You pay tax on UK earnings, and then you pay this flat 30k if you've lived here for 7 out of the past 9 previous tax years, rising to 60k if it's 12 out of the last 14. And then past 15, you can't claim non-dom anymore.
No, you cannot.
And there's 74,000 people claiming non-doms in status in 2022 to 2023. And most notably, like you said, Rishi's wife used to.
Yeah. So what are the proposed policy changes, Jack? Obviously, Labour have made this a big political issue. They're claiming that it's essentially unfair. It provides a lot of high net worth individuals a very easy tax loophole, let's be honest. And that has also led to the Conservatives being almost quite anti it as well, right?
Yeah, like you say, it's this concern that it can be quite easily turned into a tax loophole, right? That you can pretend like your primary residence is somewhere else that's paying low or no tax, when actually, you're
I mean, it's
really
very conceivable. You could have a permanent residence in UAE earning zero income tax and capital gains tax, and then live here on a quasi-permanent
Exactly.
basis.
So that's the concern. That's why it's become so political. Now, before we talk about Labour's changes, we really need to talk about what the Tories did first. So before, like I said,
all roads lead back to the Tories.
You can't get away from
You can't get away from
no.
it, no.
So like we said, past 15 years, you can't claim non-dom status. But in 2024, March 2024, Jeremy Hunt changed it so that it now was a cap of 4 years. So past 4 years.
And that was going to take effect in 2025, correct?
Yes,
was it?
That's right.
Yeah.
April 2025. Current non-doms would only have 2 years for that adjustment to take place.
Yeah.
So it's essentially moving towards getting rid of non-dom.
Yeah,
And
it seems to be the only difference between the Conservatives and Labour is the speed in which they're trying to get rid of it.
Yes, so Labour in the long run, I believe, want to get rid of it completely. I think this was a halfway house for the Tories where they didn't want to get rid of it completely. I'm not completely sure about that. But the changes for Labour is that they want to include foreign assets held in trusts within the inheritance tax framework. And they also want to remove the 50% discount in the first year. And they believe that, so on top of the 2.7 billion raised by the Tories side of things by 2028, Labour believe that it'll raise an extra 2.6 billion over the next parliament.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously this goes back to the idea of fairness as well. Labour's very much recognising there needs to be tough decisions made on the fiscal side of the economy. And I think it's almost symbolic, this policy that we need to change. Not only make hard decisions for normal, median, average Joes, but also people who are managing to avoid this very significant tax through this loophole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great introduction. So, Charlie, what are your thoughts on it?
I love it, Jack.
I know for a fact you do not.
Okay, so, I mean, there is... I think broadly this is a almost symbolic policy, to a degree, but I do have some serious problems with it. I recognise that there is currently an issue whereby if you're a normal person and you're working in the UK as well as another country, then you might, under some circumstances, have to pay tax twice. However, although that might seem unfair on the surface, I do believe if you're using the public services and using the infrastructure and possibly using the education system as part of your residency in the UK and the US, or sorry, not US, but another country, then you should have to pay tax twice. And there might even be the case where, even without the non-dom status, there are agreements in place between countries, so you don't have to pay tax twice anyway, right?
Yeah, no, that's a really important part, is that if you were past that 15 years or whatever and you didn't have the non-dom status, that there are agreements between, like here in the USA, with double taxation agreements that stop that from happening.
Yeah, exactly. And I imagine those are sort of similar to the EU and other similar countries.
I
would
imagine that it's got to be for other
100%,
countries.
But yeah. I know sort of anecdotally that, thinking back, there are some people I know who don't get taxed twice between particular countries. So I think even without the non-dom status, you wouldn't have this problem on a massive basis. But also there is an element of, if you're using the public services of both countries, I think there's a case to be made. You need to contribute to those countries.
And I'll tell you what, that's the sort of strange part of it, is that you pay UK tax on the money you earn in the UK.
Yeah.
Which is the opposite of what you're talking about, which is it's about the services you're using,
Yes.
not that you're earning money.
And all that. And then I would almost argue that the way that it's designed currently actually even leads to its downfall, because what a lot of free market economists, or at least free market politicians, will argue is for the high net worth individual argument, where by having this essentially a tax loophole, or at least desirable tax system, you encourage high net worth individuals to immigrate to the UK. And the economic argument behind that is that they invest in the UK, they spend their money, which essentially stimulates the demand, and then trickles down into employment and broader positive beneficial outcomes. I would reject a lot of this argument solely on the basis that because you are still paying tax on UK earnings, there's no additional incentive to invest in the UK. You're better off staying in a low tax country and still investing in the UK from abroad, given how good globalization is and how connected the world has become. So I think because you're still paying tax in the UK, there's no additional incentive to spend in investment terms on improving productive capacity. And then you're just sort of boiling it down to, well, they've got more demand, they can spend more because they're very high net worth. And then you go, yeah, but if you're not basing that with any productivity increases, there's no economic benefit anyway. So my argument basically pins down to that when you're looking at it from the high net worth individual argument, personally.
So what do you feel about it?
I'm in favour of the removal of non-dom, personally. Completely. And shamefully, I don't have an amazing alternative, but I think some flat taxes for the ultra-wealthy that are imposed in other European countries are interesting. I don't necessarily think they're good for the UK, because I believe in proportional taxes, but I think in general, or you have a maximum amount, a proportional non-dom tax system, where it's not necessarily that you're paying all of these people with a broad brush, but you're basing it on the percentage of incomes in different countries, and you just make it manageable while remaining fair. I think currently we just have a very outdated system.
Yes, it dates back to, am I right in saying colonial times or something? Yeah, so that people who in other colonies and things could keep some of their financial assets and things. I
imagine in colonial times there was some political game playing going on with this policy as well.
So I think we can say it's fairly outdated if that's the roots of it.
Fairly,
yes. I'm not aware of other countries that
was
have
outdated as the American Constitution. Yeah, I said it.
And we've lost our American listener.
Goodbye, Clive.
But I'm not aware of another country that has a similar sort of system to us. I think it's more like a residency-based system, so it's based on proportion of where you're staying normally, which makes more sense, right?
Yeah, but this essentially goes back. This is almost an argument that the free market politicians have won for a while, because they essentially are very much in favour of a simplified tax system. And non-dom is quite as simple as taxes go. But also with simplicity, you're not having the same level of granularity you need for an actually effective economic policy. So I would argue there just needs to be a little bit more thought into the proportionality of who's being taxed, and also making sure that you can avoid these loopholes, or close these loopholes a little bit more effectively. And if the simplest way of doing that is removing non-dom and coming up with another system, then I'm very much in favour of that.
Yeah. I mean, I like that you've pointed out proportionality, because there is a problem with this system where it's just a flat, 30k or rising to 60k.
Yeah.
Because 30 to 40% of UK residents with income of 5 million and above claimed non-dom status. So you could definitely be receiving more than 30k flat from these people.
And this goes back to, again, right to the root of this policy, which people tried to hide almost behind the fairness of the policy of not being taxed twice for normal people. But this policy is pointed towards high net worth individuals because of the flat tax nature of it, to a degree. It's relatively, people who earn more pay a very similar amount of tax to people who earn less at the higher level. So it's sort of disguised that, and that is all pointed at just trying to attract these high net worth individuals, compete with like Spain, UAE, Singapore, Monaco, these tax havens, which, people have been very much adamant on having since post-Brexit. And I just don't believe that's the way to run an economy, personally. And we can talk about different examples if you wanted, but broadly, I think attracting high net worth people to the UK, although make some streets look a little bit nicer, possibly, it fuels the housing crisis. I genuinely believe that, especially if those people are allowed to buy up multiple homes. It could lead to the over-gentrification of areas, pushing people out of their lifelong homes, and also the pressure on public services, which obviously at the moment we do not need additional pressure on public services, especially if they're not funding the productive side of the economy. But I guess this goes to the Laffer curve argument, doesn't it?
Oh God, I'm
Here
scared
we
to
go.
bring
So
that
we
up.
have, for the viewers, we have tried this episode a couple of times, and I think our main source of difference is on the Laffer curve argument.
I think
correct? So what is the Laffer curve, Jack?
Yes. So for non-economists in our audience, or
Get
people
out.
who need a,
No, I'm joking.
or simply people who need a refresher, the Laffer curve is talking about how much tax revenue you can receive at different levels of tax rates. Now, obviously, at 0% tax rates, you're not going to gain any tax revenue. At 100%, you're probably not going to get any either because people won't do anything. So you can imagine there has to be this sort of inverted U-shaped relationship between tax revenue and tax rates. The big political...
Or you might call it an N-shape, Jack.
If you wanted to be direct about it, yeah, all right. I saw it written like that and I thought it's the right way
I know
to...
it was. I just thought...
It's to distinguish against a capital N.
Yes,
Thank you very
okay,
much.
yeah, oh, absolutely, that
So,
makes sense.
but the big debate, both I can imagine politics has got its filthy mitts on this economic topic,
disgusting little hand.
is basically the shape of this curve. We know that it would be N-shaped relationship, but where does it peak?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the main, almost defines a lot of the political discussion, right? The efficiency of free markets and how much you think tax...
Wow, is this going to be our last episode?
Yeah,
we
well,
just solved it.
no, well, this is politics. But a lot of the political discourse is underpinned by this argument, right? Where do you think taxes peak? A lot of free market economists would say it would peak at very low taxes. That's the Ronald Reagan argument. And their sort of idea is, when Reagan was president, tax revenue did increase massively, almost doubled, with lower taxes because of the consequent economic growth. That was the idea. But other people might say, well, there's other things that underpin people's incentives to work and people's incentives to stay in a particular country. So higher taxes really don't reduce the tax revenue at all, like free market is with respect. And I think our main point of difference is I probably believe the Laffer curve is a little bit more rightward skewed. I think you can probably have quite a high level of tax that maximizes tax revenue.
I think we certainly disagree on this issue. We'll definitely do a separate episode on the Laffer curve itself.
I think that's what we've come to conclusion.
Definitely.
So with the non-dom status, how does this tie into the Laffer curve?
Yeah, so part of the reason I think that it's slightly less skewed to the right than you would believe is because there's the international effects that if you raised these taxes too high on these high net worth individuals, especially if they're getting taxed twice. I know that there's those double tax arrangements and things like that, but if you tax them too much, that they would move their residence elsewhere and you wouldn't gain any tax. So that movement geographically would actually reduce taxes, not just about how much output. So the normal Laffer curve is talking about the incentives to work and produce output, but this one's also the international effects of people actually moving.
Yeah. So your argument essentially is that by having the non-dom status, even though on the surface it's lower tax and there are loopholes, you can still raise tax revenue, even though it's on the surface apparently unfair towards middle income people.
See, I believe that reducing the non-dom, the taxes related to non-dom, that won't raise tax revenue. I don't believe we're on that side of the Laffer curve. I'm just saying that I believe that it exists to the extent that there is a limit how much revenue we can extract from these high net worth individuals. If we increase the taxes too high, you won't get these benefits. Like we said, that Labour believes they're going to get an extra 2.6 billion, which is like 25% uptick for the full figure.
They would predict that we would actually get an increase, that you'd always get the opposite of the Laffer curve effect, whereby increasing the tax on these people would increase revenue.
Well, I think they just believe we're on the left side of the Laffer curve, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough. I think that's probably correct.
But in which case, I mean, in my mind, that essentially invalidates any of the benefits, well, a lot of the economic benefits of this policy, which was that it could possibly encourage high net worth individuals here and you could gain tax revenue from them. Because I don't believe in the structural economic argument of the extra spending and investment or whatever for the reasons I've mentioned. The only, on the surface, economic benefit is this tax revenue, which if you don't subscribe to the Laffer curve argument is also...
Yeah, I understand that. I think the bit that's really come to me when I read the IFS reports, so I got their first, Charlie.
Damn it, that's 3 times. We've recorded this 3 times and he's beaten me to the IFS 3 times. I hope that Paul Johnson isn't.
It's because I can't have you in the interview room getting there first. Okay, so
I'm definitely not showing them this podcast.
But the IFS mention that there's significant uncertainty surrounding this policy, and one of the main reasons for that is just the lack of data and previous analysis of it. Given that we're one of the only, well, probably the only country that has this policy, it's not really been fiddled with for ages. So really, they've got no evidence to guess how much tax revenue we would actually make.
And on the surface, you look at this and you go, because of globalization and because of the connectivity of people, mobility of high net worth individuals have moved. But you said an I. I'm going to raise you an I, and I'm going to talk the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Yeah.
Hello.
Sit down, son. You stay in the UK, buddy. I'm going global. So the study by the IMF shows that there's actually very little evidence for high net worth individuals holding foreign assets abroad, even in our very high tax regimes like Scandinavia. And they said that tax levels and offshore wealth link is tenuous, and I would add at best, from what I was reading. And I think evidence doesn't seem to be given much support. Although there is more mobility, the reasons for these mobility seem to be a little bit more tenuous, I would argue. And I think my main reason for believing that probably get away with higher taxes is because I believe there's so much more to individuals' relocation decisions than tax. It's things like language, culture, which are so invariant, they don't change. But also things like the quality of education, the security, the political stability, which is a massive thing for the UK currently. Education for their kids. I think there's so much more for high net worth individuals than just, these are people at the end of the day, Jack. We do have to remember they're not monsters.
Are you saying this to me? What?
Yeah, no, I know. I'm trying to get a wealthy donor, Jack. Watch me cook. No, but the argument is that I believe there's so much more to this than tax, although tax is a big point. So can I talk about the reason I think that the non-dom status might be a good reason?
Oh, I'm excited for this.
And this is something I haven't read. I haven't researched. I know pretty much nothing about, but I just think that this makes sense.
Okay, really building
No.
Is this because you just said you're going global and you actually realised that you're going to have to pay these taxes?
Yeah, exactly. By going global, I mean Bristol. So, my main argument in support of non-dom from a structural economic standpoint is that this policy could be used as a way of making economies slightly more recession-proof. There is evidence to suggest that high net worth individuals' spending is relatively invariant. It doesn't really change as much as people who are on lower incomes. And that's essentially one because their needs are met much more easily. Fluctuations in income don't affect their necessities in the same way, and there is much more stability in their spending. Even if it's not very stable, it's still very high amounts of spending. And because recessions predominantly are very demand focused, with the exception of probably COVID, but because they're very demand focused, by having high net worth individuals who are spending consistently to dampen these demand shocks could theoretically help in making your economy slightly more recession-proof. Obviously, there's a counter-argument to that, where if you have more high-net-worth individuals, you're probably more exposed to a financial sector, so there's another argument there, but there is a line of thought.
The point is that you tried to be balanced.
I tried.
I'm not sure how well it worked.
No, but I'm just saying there's a few lines of argument to
I'm
this.
glad that you tried to be objective on it. That's really good.
Yeah, but remember the financial argument as well.
Absolutely. But I think the key point for me is that this has become such a political issue. And like we said, we call it politics unspun because we're taking a political issue and making it objective. And the point is, it's not a huge policy.
No, it's been blown so far out of proportion for what it is. I mean, you consider about the things that we really need help with in this country. You know, I know this is incorporated into the recent 22 billion figure, but just the 22 billion black hole, which is considered a huge cost, this is worth about a tenth of it.
Yeah.
So when we're considering the big change, I mean, what did the NHS doctors' pay deal cost? 9 billion? So it's like 4 times that, four and a half times that. So
And these
You
are
know,
projected
and-
revenues
yeah,
as
and these
well.
are just
like these
and
are-
also they're probably relatively optimistic because they are done by the government imposing
big?
them.
No.
No, absolutely not. So I think we can both come to a consensus that this is a policy that's been blown massively out of proportion. And that's the goal of this podcast, isn't it? To really try and put things back in perspective, look at things a little bit more on a facts basis, and think about them a little bit more in terms of policy.
Yeah, it's been blown out of proportion, and I just want to add a final point, which is what we would change the system to, perhaps. So I believe it sounds like you would get rid of it completely. Right?
I would get rid of it, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm leaning towards that as well now. The third attempt at this podcast, I think I've changed my opinion. But maybe either to a residency-based system or relying more on those agreements with other countries, like with the USA, where we stop that double taxation.
Yeah, and also making it slightly more proportional. That's another really big thing as well. Yeah.
So can see there being benefit of a international effort. So it's a bit similar to what Biden did with the corporation tax being. Yeah. So I believe it's a corporation tax. Is it a 15%?
It's 15%,
which
I believe.
is generally
So that's a global minimum corporation tax, so that countries essentially can't compete on attracting multinational corporations.
And you can see a similar sort of thing, not with multinational corporations, but with high net worth individuals. And if we introduce that, you would take away that Laffer curve argument.
And this is also an argument made by the French economist Thomas Piketty, who wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century, which you probably could do an episode on.
Oh god, that would be a long episode. That book is huge.
Yeah, we could summarize. But his argument was that you need a capital tax which would be globally enforced, and that essentially is to stop countries competing, a race to the bottom, basically, of tax rates, and that would be ideal. Yeah. Unlikely in our lifetime, but
so we've tempted you with a future policy we can talk about there. So
we're making this up on the spot. We might as well keep going. And yeah, Clive, call in whenever you feel the need.
Yeah, are you there, Clive? I'm starting to believe you're not real.
It's almost like no one's listening. Yeah. Okay. Well, non-dom completed, mate.